Hello and welcome to Culture, the world's first esoteric festival. This is our channel. Great to see you here, and it's recorded in the Marrakesh studio, so we say in Moroccan, Jijuka, something good come to you. In 2020, it was found out that London was thousands of years older than previously thought. Discoveries by archaeologists in Shoreditch revealed this. This show is taken from excerpts from my book with Toy Newton, London's Mystical Legacy. At the time when we wrote the book in 2012, and just before that, we were actually talking to somebody from London Museum, rather ridiculed actually. It's ironic to think that now our book and our theory is correct, and London Museum is having to relabel itself. This show is taken from London's Mystical Legacy. It is the chapter called New Jerusalem. So I hope you enjoy, and do of course hit subscribe. Thanks again. Bye. 1666, the fire of London destroyed most of the city. It broke out in Pudding Lane at the Royal Bakehouse of one Thomas Lockyear. At the time, most buildings in London were constructed from timber and often erected one on top of another with overhanging projections, making the fire a catastrophe waiting to happen. The Great Fire raged for 4 days before it was finally extinguished, having laid waste to a once prosperous city. No fire in any other Western European city has been so destructive. Miraculously, only 6 people were reported to have lost their lives in the whole episode, which was exacerbated by a hot, dry summer and strong easterly winds. But this devastating event became decisive in shaping the future of London in 2 ways. Firstly, it provided an opportunity to rebuild the city under central planning, and secondly, it is said to have eradicated much of the vermin responsible for spreading the plague. Both events are said to have paved the way for London's emergence as Europe's premier capital, which it remains to this day. In the aftermath of the Great Fire, King Charles expressly forbade the construction of any more wooden buildings. Should a similar event ever take place again, then obviously it was necessary to construct things which were fireproof. The royal command was later reinforced by the Rebuilding Act, passed by Parliament in February 1667. This piece of important legislation specified the width of roads, permissible types of buildings, their placements, and other measures designed to ensure that the city was made as resistant to large-scale fires as possible. Never again would accidental fire pose a threat to the well-being of London. Soon after the fire, a group of commissioners was formed to oversee these new rebuilding works. Among them were the architects such as Sir Christopher Wren and Robert Pratt, royal official Hugh May, Royal Society member and professor of geometry Robert Hooke, city surveyor Peter Mills, and carpenter/surveyor Edward German. All of these luminaries were steeped in esoteric lore, being either free thinkers or members of secret societies. These men were some of the brightest minds of their day. Hooke feuded with Newton over physics and later proposed a wave of light theory, not to mention leaving us Hooke's law, that is, the stretching is directly proportional to force. These commissioners were greatly inspired by some of the classical cities of Europe and wished to do away with London's hodgepodge, labyrinthine sprawl of medieval streets. Their vision was to create a new Jerusalem, a spiritual city of sacred proportions. The buildings that sprung up in the wake of the Great Fire transformed the ravaged capital, creating labour and a vibrant trade in much-needed building materials. A second Act of Parliament commissioned the construction of 52 new churches under the guidance of Sir Christopher Wren, with the finest of them being the Baroque masterpiece, St. Paul's Cathedral. Dedicated to the patron saint of London, the new cathedral was built on the site of an earlier edifice of the same name, which itself was built upon the original temple of Diana left by Brutus, if myth is to be believed. Wren's vision for a stone-constructed city was not to be entirely realized. His plan was curtailed and hamstrung by a number of factors relating to the deeds on buildings and the ground on which they were built, which is why, to this day, London is laid out according to its medieval jumble rather than a clearly delineated street plan. However, in the midst of this tangle of London's winding lanes and streets, Wren and his contemporaries did manage to transform London, as it were, a phoenix rising from the ashes. In the design of St. Paul's, Wren combined his interest in the classical civilizations of Greece and Rome with his love of astronomy. The cathedral platform is made specially for stargazers. There is also one anomaly, the acoustic properties of its design, which can still be experienced in the Whispering Gallery in the cathedral's mighty dome. The gallery is so named owing to the fact that the visitor may whisper against the wall, and the sound will travel across the dome to the opposite side of this wall, where the whisper may be heard by another person. But it is also rumoured that Nicholas Hawksmoor, an inspired architect who aided Wren in the building works, constructed another room to experiment with even odder acoustic properties. Here, it is said, a person may shout at the top of their voice into the ear of another who will hear nothing at all. A curious story that is something of a myth shrouded by time, but we shall return to the mysterious Hawksmoor later in some detail in these London episodes. In this massive rebuilding project, buildings such as the Guildhall, the Royal Exchange, Customs House, and the mighty Doric column known as the Monument, which commemorates the supposed place where the Great Fire first took hold, all sprung up in a matter of years following 1666 and the Great Fire. It would seem that divine intervention had saved the ravaged city, suggesting that London itself had a unique destiny. Wren obviously felt that Brutus and the original temple to the moon goddess Diana should be marked or even celebrated, and there was a spiritual providence overruling the temporal nature of the individual lives of London residents. Wren had at least given city dwellers at the time, and future generations later on, a glimpse of the sacred, and left a remarkable symbolic vision for the new city, with St. Paul's Cathedral acting as the jewel in its crown. Just 6 years before the Great Fire, an outstanding association had been formed in the wake of a speech given by Sir Christopher Wren at Gresham College in Bishopsgate, where he was Professor of Astronomy. In the wake of his celebrated oration, a number of dedicated people formed around him. This association of progressives and freethinkers would become the Royal Society. Within a week of this famous lecture, Robert Moray, an influential Mason with court connections, had a word from the King that the Society had gained his seal of royal approval, and he gave them a royal charter. What is remarkable about the formation of the Royal Society is the seismic shift away from former secrecy of scientists, who are really alchemists and magicians, to a new idea that experiments ought to be conducted publicly and the results shared. The Royal Society wished to remove barriers to learning, such as language and political divides, while promoting the idea of objective truth and reason. The Royal Society's influence on the rebuilding of London and coining of the term the New Jerusalem shows clearly that the fellows of the Royal Society held spiritual beliefs that went far beyond mere architecture. Wren and fellow Royal Society members explored other esoteric ideas, the belief that the British races, the Scottish, the Manx, the Irish, Welsh, Cornish, along with the ancient Britons, were descended from the lost tribe of Israel. A sacred bloodline mythos underscores this very idea of a British Empire and a ruling elite running very deep through some Celtic royal families right into the British nation state itself. The Tudors were certainly keen to weave in ideas of hereditary connections through their Welsh/Trojan ancestors. Some of these elements have influenced the biblical Masonic elements within the Royal Society, who viewed themselves as Britons, to be inheritors of a mystical lineage springing from ancient times, projecting that vision onto the environs of London. Guildhall, for example, the newly commissioned town hall for London, came to symbolise the power and majesty of the New Jerusalem. The Royal Society and its legacy can be viewed on many fronts, but it set in motion the spiritual domination of the city, differentiating it from another metropolis or one of the many walled citadels of Europe, London had a meaning and purpose. The Royal Society ensured that this was fused together. The city's past, present and future were melded into a cohesive, recognizable form. Call it destiny. Nearly 100 years after this first wave of visionaries in the Royal Society, who'd made their mark upon London and added a unique perspective to the mystical landscape of the city, the celebrated poet, artist and mystic William Blake was born. His birth in Broad Street, now called Broadwick Street, in Soho, saw him christened in St James, Piccadilly, and later apprenticed to an engraver after finishing his schooling. Later in life he married and settled in Poland Street before moving to Lambeth. For a time he moved from the capital to take up residence in Feltham, West Sussex, before returning to London once more. His only residences to survive intact are in Feltham in Sussex and South Molton Street. Today he is considered one of the greatest British artists, a printmaker and a poet. But in his day few had time for his work, and he lived a precarious existence. Few who had encountered him had valued or understood his works. Some even regarded him as mad. Comparing Blake with the likes of Wren and other members of the Royal Society, it's certain that he was not staid, respected or influential, and at times he waded into the waters of revolutionary politics, satire and the solid British tradition of liberty for the common man. But his entry into all of the above was rather like that of his peer Emanuel Swedenborg, a gentle and refined process. Blake remains transcendental in every sense. Blake's book, Jerusalem, is hailed as his greatest work, and within it he rejects the modern philosophy of man by inventing his own inner material worlds to inhabit. The great mills of the industrious are labelled as satanic, and Blake drew his inspiration from sources such as the Bible, Druidry, Hebrew mysticism, and of course the natural world. As a child, Blake saw a vision of God and continued throughout his life to be inspired by these divine revelations, which drove him to produce the most fantastic drawings, etchings and paintings. Blake's wife was loyal to his cause, and they worked together to produce books of his engravings and poetry. Public recognition was, to say the least, scant, and life was hard for the couple, as Blake was an artist before being a businessman. His famous poem, later set to music, gives us another insight into his inspiration, which may suggest his parallel was Sir Christopher Wren and the Royal Society. And did those feet in ancient time walk upon England's mountains green? And was the Holy Lamb of God on England's pleasant pastures seen? And did countenance divine shine forth from our clouded hills? And was Jerusalem builded here among these dark satanic mills? Bring me bow of burning gold, bring me arrows of desire, bring me my spear, O clouds unfold, bring me my chariot of fire. I will not cease from mental flight, nor shall my sword sleep in my hand, till we have built Jerusalem in England's green and pleasant land. Immediately there is a suggestion that England's green and pleasant land is somehow visited by the Lamb of God, an allusion to an ancient tradition of Joseph of Arimathea. Or are there other traditions at work here? Once Blake's own interests are understood clearly, it leads us to the idea that there may be a deeper meaning to his words that are awash with the mystical, even holy reference points. Jerusalem may seem to point to a place revered by Christians, but there is a notion that this is just a thin veneer of old Royal Society beliefs behind the form and the words. The blending of Christian symbolism with London's pagan origins paint a very different picture, a place of secret signs, sacred proportions, knowledge of the heavens, old gods, and druidic groves. One suspects that the churchmen of his age, who were of little or no interest to Blake, had no idea of his true inspiration. The New Jerusalem is no longer a place just merely composed of stone. It had found a voice, a true champion of the city and of the land, whose visionary powers, derived by dreams and angelic visitations gave a new, inspired, and altogether different insight into human nature and the cosmos. London had found its druidic thread once more through Blake. It would take some time to filter through, and Blake brought the New Jerusalem mythos to life. His remains are buried in Bun Hill or Bone Hill near Old Street. Some others involved with the rebuilding of the capital had even more esoterically based notions of grandeur. John Evelyn, for example, planned to reconstruct London on the base of the Kabbalistic Tree of Life. Evelyn previously documented his Kabbalistic convictions concerning a careful arrangement of the environment which could influence the soul and spirits of man and prepare them for converse with angels, as he put it. The angel's role in Kabbalistic philosophy being that of emissary operating within the physical and metaphysical planes. Wren himself used aspects of the Kabbalah in the design of St. Paul's, namely the 10 domes corresponding to the 10 spheres of the Sephiroth and the classical heavens. It was here that a royal tradition spanning centuries was broken when in 1981, on a warmer summer's day, the Royal Prince of Wales married Lady Diana Spencer instead of tying the knot in the customary Westminster Abbey. Whether this had any bearing to it being the ancient Temple of Diana, we will never know. St. Paul's, the venue of Diana's marriage, where Brutus was said to have raised the first temple to Diana, is also connected to the mysterious London Stone. In one account of the London Stone's story, it's also known as the Brutus Stone, Brutus is said to have laid it as the central altar of a stone circle. 14 times David Hamblin ponders in the theory that such a circle may well have existed at the St. Paul's site, being that it was once a pagan site. John Wilcock writes, the stone is obviously of prehistoric derivation and must once have marked the important ritual site, though some believe it is to date from a later period in history. Wilcock describes it as a grubby limestone block about 2 foot square. Incidentally, I did inspect the London Stone. I was very lucky when there was some building work there. I went in there with the actor Robert Goodman and we were able to touch the stone. Normally it's behind a grill and behind glass, but I'm one of the few people that's managed to see it at close hand, but not for very long. By the 16th century, this London Stone had been set into the ground in front of what is now Cannon Street Station. The stone's been moved over the years. It found itself in the wall of St. Swithin's Church, which is nearby its final resting place now. It's also been moved to the London Museum in 2016, I believe, where it was subject to a number of tests. And there are several myths, and I state the fact that they are myths connected with this London Stone. One of those played with by Blake in his poetry was that the stone was a sacrificial stone of the Druids. However, there is no proof to say that. Another myth is the London Stone has the destiny of the great city linked to it, and so therefore if the stone is destroyed or moved away, London's destiny will plummet. Well, that is again part of its myth. We don't know where that comes from, and it has actually diminished in size over the years, so it seems it's either been chipped away or damaged. And when I saw it, as I say, it was 2 foot roughly long, and it remains about that size now. So if the stone is destroyed, London will fall. I don't know where the name the Brutus Stone comes from. Some people suspect that it was the Reverend Richard Williams Morgan, who was a priest and a Welsh bard, who formed one of the Druidic orders, the ancient British Church. The Welsh, of course, in his mind, were the guardians of so much esoteric knowledge, and I think he may have come up with a fantasy around the stone, so it became a talisman of London, and it seems to rest with him. However, that may have been taken from an earlier oral source. This is unknown, and we must remain open-minded of that. The custodian, of course, of the London Stone in this mythos is the Lord Mayor of London, not the Mayor of London, the Lord Mayor of London, who is connected with the livery companies, and he becomes the guardian of or she becomes the guardian of the stone. John Clarke, a professor at the London Museum, has written about London or Brutus stone. He sees it entirely as a fictional or fetish stone set up when London was first settled. He particularly references the fact that it is Oolithic limestone, which was imported by the Romans in construction of the buildings, and sees it probably as a milestone of some kind. It may well have been placed outside a large Roman residence as evidence of its importance, to symbolize that somebody important lived there. He doesn't like the Brutus mythos, and he sees that the Brutus label was only referenced back to 1862. Well, as I say, that is in writing, but it may well be an oral tradition. We don't know. One of the significant problems for John Clarke and the London Museum is, if you go into their museum today, you will see models of Roman London. You will see signs saying that London was founded by the Romans. Unfortunately, the apple cart was set upside down in 2020 because archaeologists actually found out that London was 3,000 years older, and there was evidence of settlements here way before, millennia before the Romans ever stepped foot in London. So a lot of John Clarke's work, a lot of the London Museum's work has now been rubbished. It will now need to be relabeled. The history as they know it will have to be completely rewritten. So we have to be cautious of London's museum's theories and perhaps call them into question, although this isn't an attack on John Clarke himself. And that's not to say that his research and education is called into question. It's about his sources, which now have to be completely questioned in every sense. What I would say about the London Stone itself and the evidence towards its importance is way before this 1862, when it was referenced as the Brutus Stone. Of course, several people would, these are historical characters, would actually place their sword upon the stone and take oaths there. It obviously had a very important part in the life of London. When a riot was started and they wanted to storm the other side of London and take the tower and so on, Jack Cade struck his sword on there and started this sort of rebellion. But it was all to do with taking oaths from the stone, the London Stone. So why did it have so much importance if it was just a milestone? We have to ask that. And it's like a lot of these things, the oral history doesn't always tally with some of the things that historians are telling us. There is a dichotomy. So I'm very cautious, but I do read John Clarke, and I recognise some of his sources. He sees what I'm doing here is entirely speculative, as he does with John Chappell, the rogue archaeologist, and the occult historian Toy Newton. And there's a couple of other people, Baron Blackett, I believe, who's called this into question, who's an archaeologist. So we have to see that there is some veneration or some importance invested into the Brutus Stone or London Stone. And why is that? That has not been explained in the London Museum. They remain silent on that matter. Then, of course, they have their own problems at the London Museum. They're going to have to totally redesign it and relabel it, because London is not a Roman-founded city. One of those that recognised the antiquity of London was, of course, Lockyear, who was the man who discovered helium. He was also the first person to travel over the city by air balloon, and he immediately recognised there was an ancient star map. Lockyear should be remembered as the very first person to also map out and recognise that Stonehenge itself was astronomically aligned. People didn't understand that before Lockyear got involved. London, in its most ancient form, could be seen as a series of ritualistic sites rather than a city. People would travel from festival to festival, and so therefore it was a ritual landscape where the people would coexist with the natural environment in a nomadic format. It was using an alternative scientific system founded by Thomas Lockyear, the Victorian scientist who discovered the gas helium. The Right Reverend John Griffiths claimed to have been able to interpret what he referred to as an interrelation of mound and alignment of ancient roads in the district of London. Griffiths was an early archaeologist influenced by Lockyear. The latter had been one of the first to realise, as we've said, Stonehenge was an advanced mathematical structure. Griffiths pointed to Stanmer, for example, as forming the apex of an equilateral triangle, which includes Windsor Castle and Salt Hill as its base. The Reverend Griffiths produced a series of figures, measurements and calculations which he acclaimed amounted to the numerical symmetry of the Stanmore-Windsor-Salt Hill alignment grouping. He advanced a theory that the sites had correlations with 3 matching stellar dates that suggested that their formation began at around 1500 BC. And of course he was well on to these recent discoveries in 2020 which back up a lot of what Griffiths and of course Thomas Lockyear had said a century before, or more than a century before I should say. Griffiths maintained that some of these alignments related to the solstices, sunrise and sunsets in May, otherwise known to pagans as Beltane, and November, pagans were called Samhain, of the Druidic Wiccan calendar system. In 1500 BC, these dates pointed to the position of the stars Capella and Sirius in connection with the geometry of the Stanmore grouping. Another collection of mounds and triangular corresponding alignments were the White Mound of the Tower of London, Penton Hill, which is near King's Cross, and Parliament Hill, which all connect in a straight line, showing Tot Hill from the base of the triangle along with the White Mound, rising to Parliament Hill as its apex. The legend of Bran, whose head is buried underneath the White Tower inside the Tower of London, is also relative here, according to Griffiths, who says that the legend of Bran is undoubtedly largely astronomical. He refers to Bran's injunction about keeping a door in a certain direction closed, presumably north. Griffiths also claims that once he saw the diagram of London's mounds, he could see that the burial has reference to leading astronomical measure worked into legend. What is seemingly beginning to emerge here is that the stellar rather than the lunar understanding of the alignments of London's ancient roads. Griffiths is very accurate in commenting, and I quote, "Mounds and straight roads should be studied together. Signal stations preceded long straight roads, and the mound builders were the pioneers of road markers. The positions of mounds, individually and relatively, were determined by astronomical requirements. The astronomy of the rods is now duplicated in related roads." Unquote. So it seems that Lockyear and his understudy, Griffiths, had a totally different understanding of the layout of London, as opposed to London Museum, who sees it wrongfully as a Roman formation, which has now proved to be wrong as far as 2020 is concerned. What we're seeing here is a way of looking at things. And when I visited John Chapel with Toy Newton, and we went to one of his discoveries, Camber's Well, the well of the son of Prince Brutus, Camber, we were taken by John Chapel, and he showed us a totally different way of looking at London, and this was also reflected in some of the names of the streets from ancient places, such as the ancient maze which was found in Peckham, which is still called Troy Street, I believe. And we found out about other festivals which took place for many years, such as the Troy Games, which is near Parliament Hill, by the way. It should come as no surprise, therefore, that it is a ritual landscape, and this has been born to be true of the latest archaeological discoveries. We're no longer looking at this inert history, but a living history, and one that's often conveyed, as I've said before, by oral history. Griffiths went further still, and he said that this astronomical way of looking at London was called the clock star alignments, and he gives several examples where he claimed that each of the mounds that he was looking at also were astronomical observation platforms, citing, for example, Streatham Church as one amongst other parish churches which served as observatories. Where two streets converge, he said, this jointly forms a star clock. It's worth remembering that conventional historians are uncertain of the origins of the shaft or well found inside the White Mound found in the tower today, which is clearly an astronomical platform of Druidic origin. From what Griffiths advanced, one can see that the same way that a blind spring marks the convergence of two ley lines as energy points, and many of London's early roads were seemingly built on such lines. All of the old churches of London are lined up, and when you look at some of the sightings of St Clement Danes, the Templar Church, St Paul's Cathedral itself, St Helena Bishopsgate, St Dunstan, Stepney, they're all of whom are oddly aligned. But why? St Paul's, of course, is the site allegedly founded by Brutus, as we said earlier in this episode. Or did Brutus simply identify a sacred enclosure known to the local inhabitants he found there and conform to the ancient knowledge available to him? Conventional historians are unable to offer even a remote explanation of this phenomena, if indeed they acknowledge it at all, the blatantly obvious alignments of every single ancient site in London. The writer John Michell knew only too well. He said, "The city churches are hidden shrines of London. Each has its own peculiar character and atmosphere, developed over many centuries. Their individuality is not impaired by the fact that they were designed by one man, Sir Christopher Wren. His policy was to rebuild on their old foundations the churches destroyed by the Great Fire, often reproducing their old features." Unquote. Michel was aware that the placement of these city churches, often described as being Saxon or Norman, were actually built upon already sanctified places, some of these being of great antiquity and most definitely of pre-Roman origin. In 2014 I was very fortunate to visit John Chappell, the rogue archaeologist. While he was excavating Camberwell, I attended the meeting with Toyn Newton, the occult historian, and we went to see him digging these trenches where he'd found this well. And these are his prophetic words 6 years before this amazing discovery in 2020.
Well, there isn't a shred of evidence that the Romans actually founded London. They never claimed to have founded London. A Roman historian actually said it was an ancient city in Roman times. The only evidence at all that's ever given is that it came into being because a bridge was built over the Thames by the Romans, and that caused the merchants to suddenly make it a city.
That was John Chappell there, speaking from Camberwell in Camberwell. Coming back to the origins of London, if you want to go and see an ancient site, most of the evidence has now been obliterated, but you can stand on Cornhill, you can stand on Parliament Hill. Most of these are recorded in the book London's Mystical Legacy, which you can buy from most decent outlets in the UK, the USA and elsewhere. Thank you once again for joining me. Hope you've enjoyed the show. It's just a short one today on London, but we'll be returning with more decent episodes of Secret London and some of the aspects of the city that are unknown. So do tune in again. This is the Psychic Jungle. Take care.